Jaha, god morgon allihopa. Ni som är utanför tältet, det finns en och annan liten plats här inne. Och vi ska precis nu dra igång. Jag heter Tate Museums. Hälsar er varmt välkomna till residensets trädgård. Oavsett om man är här via etern eller här i tältet eller i trädgården utanför. And you sir, most welcome to the garden. Vi befinner oss ju i ett kulturarv. Ett världsarv till och med. Visby har under tusentalet år varit en smältdegel. En smältdegel av olika kulturer, nationaliteter och religioner. Och på så sätt och vis så är ju Almedalsveckan en fortsättning på detta kulturarv. Ett slags modern Hansestad dit människor vallfärdar för att mötas, utbyta idéer och lära av varandra. Och Almedalsveckan är ju, tack och lov, öppen för alla oavsett om man är här i arbetet, turist eller gotlänning. Samtidigt har ju Gotland en historia av gränsdragning och det är det som mycket kommer att handla om också på förmiddagen nu. En gränsdragning mellan stad och land. Och ringmuren, vårt världsarv, är ju på sätt och vis också yttersta tecknet på det här. Och än idag så finns det faktiskt spänningar mellan vad som anses som centrum och vad som är perifert. En allt jämt pågående debatt om vad ska göras, var ska det satsas, vem får ta del och inte minst var sker besparingarna. På samma sätt kan man tänka sig att Gotland befinner sig i periferin sett till Sverige och Stockholm i övrigt. För det är ju faktiskt så här att när vi pratar om fördelning av kultursatsningar och pengar så är det någon som ska fördela den. Och vem är fördelaren? Vad skulle hända om fördelaren inte satt i centrum? Ny teknik och digitalisering öppnar visserligen upp, men det är faktiskt så. Men rättvisa och jämlikhet handlar ju om värderingar och när det gäller kultur och mycket annat så förefaller det vara en slags urban norm som gäller. Men det händer faktiskt väldigt mycket utanför centrum. Jag ska skryta lite. Vi är bäst i landet på bredbandssatsning, fiber överallt. Vi har Gotlands museum som ofta får utmärkelser och fick stora turistpriset 2016. Medeltidsveckan, vecka 32 här på Gotland, har blivit utnämnd till årets turistmål 3 år i rad. Bergmanveckan känner ni säkert till. En stor internationell lockelse. Och vi har vecka art, vecka vinter, vecka golf. Vi har oerhört mycket kultur. Ja, det ska bli jättespännande. Jag ska välkomna dig upp. Ulrika Stuart Hamilton. Det är en stor dag. Det är mycket kultur här. Det är 4 juli. Och dessutom har du namnsdag. Ja, välkommen. Välkomna allihopa.
Tack så jättemycket Peter Molin, länsråd. Well, everybody here and also those watching us over the internet, you are very, very welcome. And as Peter mentioned, my name is Ulrika Stuart Hamilton and I'm the chairman of the board of Kulturrådet. This event is hosted by the Cultural Collaboration Committee, Samverkansrådet, and you can see all the different agencies involved behind me here. Obviously, we're all waiting and looking forward to our keynote speaker, who will give us interesting perspectives on today's theme, equitable distribution of culture, divisions within and between countries. And we will examine that from international perspectives as well as trying to fit it into our Swedish context. Our keynote speaker here today is a renowned figure with many years' experience in the field of cultural policy, Sir Nicholas Serota, the chair of Arts Council England. And in his speech, he will describe how Britain has become a mecca for contemporary art and culture over the last 4 decades, Sir Nicholas has already gone down in history for his visionary dynamism and unfaltering belief in the importance of culture. As director of Tate Modern, he transformed this institution into the world's most visited museum, with 5 million visitors a year and branches beyond London. As chair of Arts Council England, his task is even wider in scope, promoting culture across the country. I'm also curious to know Sir Nicholas' views on how Brexit will affect these issues in the future. Access to culture highlights certain divisions in society. Urbanization is one of them. Much of the funding for culture is concentrated to metropolitan areas, despite officially stated objectives that culture should be available to everyone. The member bodies of the Cultural Collaboration Committee, Samverkansrådet, our host today, promote culture throughout Sweden in a variety of ways. Thanks to the cultural collaboration model, kultursamverkansmodellen, as we know it, the regions now enjoy greater influence, as several studies actually have shown. Other megatrends with a major social impact are globalization and digitalization. The issue at stake here is how, for example, Swedish regions and communities can benefit from building international relationships. After we've listened to the keynote speaker, we'll have a conversation with Per Olsson Fridh, State Secretary of the Swedish Ministry of Culture, and Katti Hoflin, newly appointed Director of Cultural Affairs at Region Västra Götaland. And this discussion will be chaired by Ellen Wettmark from the Swedish Arts Council, who was previously a cultural counselor at the Swedish Embassy in London. In conclusion, I welcome everyone here joining us in the garden or watching us on the live webcast. The video recording will be posted online with Swedish subtitles in due course. Those of you in the audience who are on social media are welcome to share your thoughts using the hashtag Kulturklyftan. We're looking forward to some fascinating discussions on the subject of cultural policy. So please, Sir Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Ulrika, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, and it seems especially appropriate that last night we learned that Sweden and England will meet in the quarterfinal. So there's no pressure. No pressure at all. It's actually also a very great pleasure to be here at Almedalen because we don't have anything quite like this in Britain. And it's surprising in a way because we're very fond of festivals and we like celebrations in the summer, which is of course a time for free thinking and kind of dreaming about the future, even a better future. So it's a great shame that we don't have an occasion in England when politicians from different parties come together to discuss issues of particular concern. In England, the parties meet separately and they make all their decisions without reference to others. So it's a very, very interesting situation for me to be here and to understand exactly how this operates here in Sweden. So before I talk about some of the themes that we're going to discuss this morning, I probably ought to say a little bit about myself, but more particularly about the Arts Council. So I'm chair of the Arts Council, which means in theory I work 2 days a week for the Arts Council. I'm not the chief executive. There are a big team that run the Arts Council, and I just act as the chair. The Arts Council was conceived by the economist John Maynard Keynes, working in the Second World War, when he realized that there was a big public appetite for the arts. And those arts had previously been available mainly to those people who could afford to be engaged. And he felt that as part of the creation of a welfare state, this year we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the foundation of the National Health Service in England, and we celebrate 72 years of the foundation of the Arts Council. 72 is not exactly a year that you celebrate, but I just want to establish that it was even conceived, the Arts Council, before the National Health Service. So originally, the Arts Council looked after what were regarded as the high points of culture. The Royal Opera House in London and many of the arts organisations in London. But over the last 50 years or so, we've seen a gradual democratisation of the arts. I mean, Ulrika referred for a moment ago to the question about the difference between policy and action in terms of access to the arts. And that continues to be a question, I think. But in principle, at least, since the mid-60s, when the first Minister for the Arts in England, a woman called Jenny Lee, who was actually the wife of the man who introduced the National Health Service, Aneurin Bevan, she became a Minister of the Arts in 1964, and in 1965 she published the first government statement on the arts, and in particular about taking the arts not just in metropolitan centres, but also taking it to what were then called the regions. This was the first time that this term was used. Before that, it was always the provinces. So they were elevated from being the provinces to being the regions. Now, if you talk about the regions, people even see that as if you were talking about the provinces. So we've moved forward. So the Arts Council is really charged with delivering that public access. And this year we are investing in more than 800 organizations of all sizes and all disciplines across the country. And we also support, obviously, thousands of individual arts projects and cultural projects each year. We are also the fund holders. That means we hold the purse for what are called the music education hubs, where young people have an opportunity to study music and to learn the skills of playing an instrument. And we also have a relationship with libraries and museums across the country, because we are the development agency for those parts of the cultural world. And I think our development role is just as important as our investment role. Our funding is directed in support of our strategic goals, which we agree with our partners and our stakeholders and with government and public. And in 2010, we published a strategy for the Arts Council for the period 2010-2020. We're currently working on a strategy for the period 2020 to 2030, which will be published next year. We've been engaged in extensive conversations across the country since the beginning of 2018 to establish what that strategy should be. We undertake research, evaluation, we offer training, we offer advice, mentoring, contacts, partnerships, and we help organizations develop new ways of diversifying their income. So like all the public sector, since 2010, our funding has been at an absolute standstill. No increase in cash terms. And therefore, of course, in real terms, a significant reduction, equivalent really to 30% since 2010. But we still invest £375 million a year of public money, and another roughly 200 million a year from the National Lottery. So in total, we have nearly 600 million a year to spend on culture across England. And that money is really the fuel for the cultural life of the nation. So I want to talk briefly about culture and what it might mean to us today, really as a context for the discussion that we will have in a moment on the platform. And I want to talk about our work in communities, and particularly our work in making places stronger, richer, and the part that culture plays in that process. And in particular about our Creative People and Places program, which is a program that we introduced in 2012 for communities that do not have or have not had great access to the arts. And I also really want to talk a little bit about cultural exchange. So first, culture. So the problem with words, as the late playwright Dennis Potter once remarked, is that you don't know whose mouth they have been in. But I think it's very important at this moment that we do think a little bit about our use of words and what we mean. And culture is an important word and an important concept. It's been absolutely central to societies from time immemorial. I mean, I was being asked a moment ago by the press, why is culture important? And culture is important. I mean, in a way, everyone in this room will give a different answer. But culture has been present in our societies from the beginning, right from the beginning. So it's not something which came more recently. It can refer to the civilizing effects of the arts and humanities, to structures of beliefs, to the habits that we share, to ideas of ethnicity or faith. It describes what holds us together, but it also describes what can drive us apart. So it can be a complementary term, someone is cultured, but it can also be quite derogatory and in some contexts actually profoundly racist. So as the historian in England, Raymond Williams, said in the 1950s in England, he wrote, "It's one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language." So the Arts Council's challenge, I think, is to take ownership of the word and use it in its most positive and inclusive sense, to stop it being appropriated or diminished, and to make it clear that it has a relevance to everyone. So its roots, as everyone again in this room will know, are quite ubiquitous. It comes from the Latin verb cultivare, to plough or to till, as in agriculture. And subsequently, it's acquired the sense of social and intellectual development. So writing in the 50s, Raymond Williams argued that in Britain at least, the meaning of the words art and culture, and our understanding of what culture is, changed around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Traditionally, art and culture had been words that were described processes and livelihoods of society and had been based around the crafts of artisans. And instead, particularly the word art, but also culture, became descriptive of a certain kind of aesthetic and intellectual activity that were in some way divorced from daily life, and divorced and opposed to some of the processes and ideas that came out of the industrial institutions. So you had this slight separation between real life, work, industry, and somehow on the other side there was this rather precious thing called art or culture. So in a way, culture became understood as an alternative to life, a retreat from it, a place where you went not to conduct your life, but to do something else, maybe with your mind. And it became a word that provoked sometimes even hostility, and quite often even embarrassment. So you don't have to agree with Williams's politics, he was a man of the left, to see that the general truth of his observation and that hostility and embarrassment have often coloured the views of the popular press and politicians in England. I mean, I spent 30 years working at the Tate, and certainly when I began there, much of what I was doing was to try to persuade the press, let alone the politicians, that actually contemporary art had a value in society, that contemporary art was an expression of contemporary mores, contemporary world, the contemporary world, contemporary life, and that it was not some, something simply for a very privileged group of people, and it was also not something which was completely separated away from life. So in Britain we do have some problems about the idea of the intellectual. and the role of the public intellectual in France, for instance, is regarded as a valuable ingredient in public life. And you know, someone can write in their passport their profession is to be an intellectual. And the passport officer doesn't look at it and say, what does this mean? Or would you please get a proper profession? Somehow, in England, the term intellectual is regarded as something that could be irrelevant or even unworldly. But I believe that a strong society needs a cultural conversation that involves everybody, not just an intellectual elite, not just a single group of people. And I believe that society as a whole needs to have a conversation and a recognition that culture can be ordinary, that it can be, as he put it, made and remade in every individual mind. So I think we need a better shared understanding of what we mean by culture, that we live and we live in, and through our culture and arts, that they should play a role alongside creative activities, hobbies, passions, pastimes, those things that fuel people's lives and through which people express themselves and share their experience. I don't think we have to believe that every man is an artist, as Joseph Beuys once said, but I think we do need to recognize that every person has a creative dimension, and they should be given an opportunity to express that. It's striking, one of the things that we have been doing in terms of thinking about our strategy for the period 2020-2030 is to invite people to talk about whether or not they are involved in cultural activities. And we've been doing this using Ipsos Mori polling methods, not going to people who attend arts events, but talking to people across the country. And it's striking how many of the people and the public that we speak to still don't see themselves as taking part in cultural activities, even though in practice they may have very busy and rich cultural lives. They read, they're involved in music, they watch television drama, they watch films, obviously alongside sport and other pastimes. These are all cultural activities, but they don't necessarily regard them as being cultural. And the idea persists that culture remains for those people who already know about culture. There's life and there's culture, and one needs somehow some kind of special passport to move from one to the other. Or perhaps you need a particular kind of education if you want to cross this border. However, I really feel that we need to seek a definition of culture that puts arts into everyday life and not beyond it, not into a separate box. It needs to be rooted in people's everyday experience and everyday lives. For the Arts Council, this is an important goal and an important journey, and it's a continuation of this sense of a post-war drive towards greater public participation. We have to admit, however, that the progress even since Jenny Lee's white paper has been slow, and we need to significantly increase the pace of change. As some of you know, the clearest expression of this intention to make a change has been our Creative People and Places programme, which invests in arts and in cultural experience in places that haven't previously enjoyed much access. So Creative People and Places was established in 2012, and it's moved from an initial 6 projects now to 21, and it crosses the country. And these are projects that evolve through a partnership with communities, and they take a view of culture that incorporates the landscape, local traditions, stories, food, industry, sport, religion, and how people spend time with their family and friends. Often, the projects shine a light on histories and lives that have not been spoken about previously. Creative People and Places works with non-arts voluntary organisations and with community groups. And these are often much closer to communities than most of the traditional arts organisations. They include, in England at least, we've been working with walking groups, refugee groups and asylum seekers, allotment societies, residence associations, playgroups, language and supplementary schools, and heritage group. There have also been trucking companies and clubs and even a group of pubs. So by the end of 2017, the project had reached more than 2 million people, most of whom had not previously really been engaged with arts activity. And we've recently announced a new round of funding so that we can consolidate and then expand the programme, and it'll take our total investment up to 2022 to £90 million. And we should probably move to somewhere between 30 and 35 organisations across the country who are involved in this activity. It's not the only way that we can achieve cultural engagement, but I think learning from it, we can, using the learning that we've had from working with particular communities, we can see that collaboration with non-arts voluntary groups, listening to what people want rather than telling them what they should have, can inform the way in which we work more generally. And I think this is particularly relevant if we want to talk about how culture contributes to placemaking in helping to rejuvenate and bring a sense of optimism to communities that have suffered economically in a post-industrial society. And there's a growing understanding, I think, of how a strong cultural life, in its broadest sense, can also bring social benefits. Cultural opportunities can reduce loneliness and isolation. Culture helps people of different backgrounds meet, explore their differences, and create a shared identity. As the UK government has recently recognised in its integration strategy, culture can play a key role in the creative industries, a sector which in England at least is growing much faster than the economy as a whole. And creative thinking that culture can instill is going to be a vital asset for every young person seeking employment in a changing society. If you don't have creativity as one of your skills, if you don't have adaptability, if you don't have a responsiveness to change, if you're fixed with a certain kind of training and a certain kind of discipline and unable to think creatively, you will not prosper in a changing society. Culture is obviously vital to, here we are in Visby, culture is vital to tourism. It's an important partner for the heritage sector, and it also contributes enormously in cities to the nighttime economy. So for the arts to contribute usefully, we need, as with creative people and places, to be sensitive to the communities we work with. We need to understand a place, its history, and the aspirations of its people. And when culture starts to help improve people's lives, it's through informing the environment they live in and are shaped by, increasing their opportunity to participate, and also giving them the chance to relate to a wider world. And for arts organisations, certainly in England, it means working with a broad range of partnerships. Traditionally, of course, we've worked with local government, but we're increasingly working with the National Health Service and with housing associations. So above all, I think it does mean partnership with the community. And we've seen some really significant successes. You look, for instance, last year, Hull on the East Coast was the British City of Culture. It had been long neglected as a city, but over the year, Hull became one of the Lonely Planet's top destinations. And it was a culmination of years of work and very focused investment involving many partners and, especially important, thousands of volunteers from the city of Hull working across the year. Hull developed for itself a unique style, and that style helped to restore civic confidence that had disappeared long before with much of the industry. And the catalyst for that change was culture. It's still, as we know, only the beginning of a story for Hull. We need to continue to make investment, but it does show what can be achieved when we don't impose cultural concepts, because the programme grew out of a discussion and a debate with the community. And we offer instead, rather than imposition, an opportunity and partnership to help people discover what culture means for them. I think this work has never really been more important if we want to recover a society in which citizens feel that they can have a say in how their lives are run, and also have a say in how they shape their own futures. I know that in Sweden you have your own Creative Places programme, which operates in a similar way to Creative People and Places in England. And it grows from a really very good relationship between our two arts councils. And it's a further example, I think, of the benefits that come from international cultural exchange. And therefore I want to conclude with a word about that international exchange and how the free flow of ideas and people across borders helps us all not simply understand each other, but actually develop new identities. Some recent political events have reminded us how valuable international work and exchange can be for the very quality, for the diversity and the strength of our individual national cultures, and also for reinforcing the bonds that transcend political events. In England, we owe much of our identity, especially on our romantic side, to the contribution of incomers. We always talk about English culture or British culture, but actually it's astonishing how much of that culture that we now regard as British has been produced by immigrants. Go back to the 18th century, Handel came from Germany to be a favourite of the British court and the London stage. If you look at Michael Powell's films, they were scripted by Emmerich Pressburger, a Hungarian refugee. One of the major influences on the current school of British landscape writing, which is very powerful in Britain today, was a German, Max, or W.G. Max Sebald. And where would our contemporary visual arts be without artists like Lucian Freud and Frank Auerbach, who stand somehow now described as the pillars of what is called a School of London, or in one generation, or you look at the current generation, artists like Chris Ofili or Mona Hatoum, Wolfgang Tillmans, John Akomfra. So the richness of cultural life in Britain comes through a combination of strong local sensibilities and a willingness to accept other cultural influences. And it's not only those who've chosen to live in Britain, but those whose work we've been fortunate enough to see that have contributed to that culture. There have been many influential theatre directors from abroad, perhaps none more so than someone like Ingmar Bergman, whose work inspired a generation of British theatre and film directors. So I believe that we need to give young people an even greater chance to see and be inspired by such creative forces than existed in my generation. And we need the stimulus of a different outlook and experience. And I think we've already been told we're going to talk about Brexit, so we will. Historically, there have been really very good links between Sweden and the other Nordic countries and the United Kingdom. And there's the agreement that exists between the region Västra Götaland, and Katti is going to speak, I think, in a moment. It exists as a relationship between the Northeast Cultural Partnership and the region here. And that was a result of long-term exchange and understanding and also recent visits. And many of the arts organizations and individual artists supported by the Arts Council have growing relationships with Sweden. So Stella Hall, the director of Thrift from Redcar, recently visited Sweden for seminars and talks. And that was a direct result of the agreement between the Northeast and region Västra Götaland. Toby Lloyd, a visual artist, is working with Helix Arts and Newcastle University and is visiting Finland and Sweden this summer to explore attitudes towards universal basic income. In Stockholm, the Mancunian playwright Andrew Sheridan, the winner of the Bruntwood Prize, is an assistant director at the City Theatre and has also been commissioned to write for them. And the Workplace Gallery in Gateshead represents the Swedish artists Jakob Dahlgren and Cecilia Stenbom. So these kind of reciprocal relationships are vital to sharing ideas and to developing creative practice. And they're also small but really integral parts of a huge economic picture. We all know that culture contributes to the economic wealth of societies. And UNESCO estimates that the size of the worldwide cultural and creative industry market is somewhere around $2.25 trillion. In 2015-16, organizations funded by the Arts Council took more than 2,400 productions overseas. We sent 140 exhibitions and took part in more than 300 festivals. And those benefits of exchange and travel flow back into communities because they represent more work for artists and performers, more money for local economies, and fresh inspiration for audiences. So all of us, I think, have an interest in ensuring that this work flourishes and grows in an unimpeded way. So the Arts Council is determined that we should look out into the world and encourage organizations that we support to do the same. In nature, there's no place for monocultures. You can create very refined, exquisite blooms in a monoculture. But if you keep planting the same seed every year in the field, you know very well that the crop diminishes. And you have to have that mixture. You have to have new things, new forms coming in to sustain and develop resilience. And we need that international exchange if we're going to make work that really engages people who are looking out into the world, help people realize their creative potential, and help people learn from and respect their neighbors. So like everyone here, my life has been enormously enriched by the arts, and I want to see everyone enjoying that kind of opportunity. And it's why I think the Arts Council's role continues 72 years on from its foundation, to be a champion for the arts, a voice for the arts, an advocate for the arts, occasionally a thorn in the side of government, in order to insist that we need to get blood, which is the money that allows us to take forward all these great practitioners of the arts, to give a voice to those who have something to express. I want to thank you all for inviting me today. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We're going to get some other people.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for this very, very inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. I think especially your comments on the relationship between art and life is something that we really should think more about, talk more about, and concern ourselves with more. Before I invite the rest of the panel to the stage, I'd like to ask you a few questions and also see if there are questions from the floor that are urgent. And my name is Ellen Wettmark. I'm the head of international affairs at the Swedish Arts Council. So I'd like to start by asking you, you've run a very, very successful museum, which was mainly based in London, and most of your career has been spent running museums in London predominantly. And now in your role at the Arts Council, you're tasked with, in a way, possibly redistributing funds from London to the rest of the country. How would you, with your experience of the role of a vital city like London and the role of arts and culture in that city, how do you balance the need for increased spending outside of the capital with the desire to also regain and keep the role of a dominant city like London vital for the arts?
Well, of course, the easiest way to do it is to persuade government to give more money and to give a higher proportion of that money to the regions rather than into London. I mean, what we have been trying to do at the Arts Council is to use the lottery funding that we've been receiving in particular, but also some of the taxpayers' money, direct taxpayers' money, to do more outside London. But we do have a responsibility, as you say, to sustain some of the best production in London. I mean, a great difficulty, I think, for us now is you talk about London, and of course there's a big difference between the centre of London and the edges of London. There are places around the edges of London, not really even very far from the centre, where there are significant areas of deprivation and economic hardship. And people don't always have an opportunity in those places to travel, and they don't have an opportunity certainly don't have an opportunity to come in to Covent Garden and watch the Royal Opera House. The Royal Opera House perhaps sometimes has to go to them, and there is an interesting link between Barking and Dagenham, one of those deprived areas, and the Royal Opera House, as it happens. But to answer your question, I think there's a real need for us to try and ensure that culture is something that people can participate in wherever they live, and not only if they're in a metropolitan centre. And if that means in the longer term that we will have to be even more stringent with the organisations that are in metropolitan centres and insist that if they're going to receive funding, that they must be working at the highest quality, but also that they must be reaching out, then of course we will do so.
And is there an understanding among the arts professionals that that might be the conclusion?
I think there's a great... Well, there is... I think there's... Look, every artist, every theatre director, every filmmaker wants to produce their best possible work. And they want that work to be, if necessary, supported. So you're not going to get a practitioner volunteering to give their money to someone else, probably. But what you can do, I think, is create a circumstance in which they recognise that it's important the Arts Council should be funding a range of art and not just one kind of art.
In your role as director of Tate Galleries, you've created some really groundbreaking initiatives, Tate Modern, of course, being the most well-known, but also the Turner Prize, which you sort of restarted. And the Turner Prize, for those of you who don't know that, is probably the most influential prize for contemporary art. But beyond being an important prize for artists, it also started a discussion that invited people that were not necessarily the usual contemporary art visitors to discuss, to have opinions, to think and talk about art. With, of course, the challenges that comes with that. But what would you say to people who are concerned with what you're talking about, the fact that not everyone feels like they are involved in the arts, that want to try to do something as sort of innovative and exciting as those things? What were your lessons that you learned from those initiatives?
I think, well, the Turner Prize was a way of focusing discussion about the nature of contemporary art, because there were each year 4 artists who were presenting different visions of the world, which may or may not touch the individual who views them. And we encourage those individuals to leave their comments in a very public place, to engage with us on social media increasingly rather than just writing comments on cards. And that helped to stimulate a debate. But I think probably the most progressive thing that the Tate was able to do while I was director was not Tate Modern and was not the Turner Prize, but was probably to make strong relationships with institutions outside London. So in 2010 we established this group which we called Plus Tate, because we kept finding that individuals cities came to us, not just individuals. Cities would come to us and say, you have a Tate in Liverpool and you have a Tate in St Ives. We would like a Tate in Norwich or in Bristol or in Newcastle. And my argument was actually that museums really flourish when they are rooted in their communities. So they grow out of those communities, they express the values of those communities. And that if you parachute in a Tate from London, and I saw this in Liverpool, it took 20 years after Tate Liverpool was created in 1988 for it to become recognised within that community as part of that community. And that only happened when Liverpool was the European City of Culture in 2008. Before that, there was always suspicion. Notwithstanding the wonderful things that were sent in terms of exhibitions. And, we began with Rothko and Giacometti and Surrealism. I mean, it was really magnificent work that was being shown. But nevertheless, it wasn't seen as being part of that community. So I learned from that really, as I say, museums have to be based in their communities. And for the Tate, it became much more effective to work with those institutions that were already established in cities. And we made this group. So instead of having, a Tate in Norwich, we would have the Sainsbury Centre plus Tate. So there was an additional bit that was added on. We called the scheme Plus Tate. There were 36 organisations. They all had special access to the Tate's collection. They all had an ability to talk to each other. And in fact, actually, they began to establish a network and hold meetings that had nothing to do with the Tate, but were exchanging their own ideas. So it's made the position of not just contemporary, but also modern and historic British art much stronger within the country.
Yeah, that might actually be an idea to pick up in Sweden and in other countries, because it sounds extremely interesting. I promised that I would ask you a question about Brexit as well before we invite the panel and other questions. In the run-up to the referendum, a poll indicated that around 96% of artists and people working in art institutions or representing art institutions were against Brexit.
Yeah.
And now everyone has to live with the consequences of the referendum. But what role first of all, what way will artists react to being sort of dragged into to this against their will? And what is the role of artists in the coming years when we're approaching this new situation?
Well, I suppose one of the roles, of course, will be for artists and arts organisations to continue to insist that the conversations have to be international rather than just national. I mean, obviously, one of the dangers of Brexit is that the country turns in on itself and that the divisions in society have become more exposed. And it's one of the difficulties, I think, with a referendum is it presents a very simple question, in or out. And we all know that life is not simple, that it's much more complex. And therefore, the arts can play a part in helping people to understand that life is complex. And we will simply have to renew our efforts to build international relationships. And at the moment, somehow, the rhetoric in England is that we have to build international relationships with countries beyond Europe. But if you look at the culture in the United Kingdom, it has so many connections with Europe. It is Europe. It may no longer be part of the economic union, but it is part of Europe. If you look against the building blocks of society across the world at large, it is part of Europe, and it will remain part of Europe in that sense. But it will be more difficult because there will be restrictions on employment. It will be more difficult, as we know, to get visas for performing artists to come at short notice to perform, and these kinds of things. But I think the Arts Council has to argue with government that these barriers need to be reduced, placed at the lowest possible level.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite the other panelists to join us on stage, and we'll also invite questions from the floor. But please join me in welcoming Per Olsson Fridh and Katti Hoflin. Per Olsson Fridh is the Secretary of State at the Ministry for...
Thank you. Good to see you. Good to see you.
And Katti Hoflin, Director of Culture Director at Västra Götalandsregionen. So Per, if I may start with you, we've heard a very interesting presentation that spanned a lot of different questions. I was going to ask you, in what way is this, are the positions and the question posed by Nick relevant in a Swedish context? Is there anything in particular you'd like to pick up on?
I'd like to pick up on exactly everything that Sir Nicholas actually addressed in his address here. I think starting from culture as a fundamental aspect of being human and of being a society. I mean, if we start there, culture as a process, as a cornerstone in a sustainable society, as a collective memory, or as our collective consciousness in society, as the heart and soul of the creative industry, as the catalyst of civic confidence, as the piece of art that makes me believe, that makes me cry, that makes me laugh, that pushes my boundaries, that makes me understand that us is much larger than them, that there is no them, in a sense. If we start there and develop policies from there, then what are we able to achieve with our society? I mean, then we can push everything, and that starting point, I think, it was very inspiring.
I agree. Katti, do you have a...
I would like to be a bit depressed to begin with. I loved your speech, very inspiring, but I keep thinking that we always talk to ourselves. We are all hallelujah, culture is so important. We know this is like a lifelong flu that you get. You have this body, which is the arts. It may be literature, it can be contemporary visual arts or anything, but you always have it in your life. And we know this. But I would like to see a much broader conversation to address these issues. Cross sectors and across many parts of society, so that culture people are not just talking to themselves all the time. So I'm thinking about, I've been a chairman of the government's reading delegation for 2 years, and we had the task of looking into, is there equal access to reading promotion and access to libraries and good education across our country?
You know there isn't.
No, of course there isn't. We're far from equal. And this is a huge problem, because if you don't get a rich language, you don't grasp the nuances, you get a bad life, you get sick, you die before your time. So this is a huge issue. And what we found in this work was, of course, that we need to collaborate on a much higher level. We need to change some structures, like the stately structures maybe, where I know that the fact that it was the Minister for Democracy and Culture and the Minister for Education who worked together was like a very big thing. And I said, yeah, but where's the finance and where's corporate life and where's the social department and so on? Because we need to have more sectors together. So that it just struck me that I love to listen to you and to be reminded of how important this is in our lives, and especially now with the elections coming up and so on. But I miss some other parts, some other actors that should also be concerned.
Is there a question from the audience? I really feel like this is the start of a great conversation rather than just an interview situation. So there's a rowing mic, if anyone dares to be the first one to raise a question. Otherwise, we'll just continue talking. Or do you look like you want to... Do you want to join? Not at all.
Oh, but it's true, you know, there's a lot of research on this, Kristin, that you really die earlier. You get sick, you take a lower education if you do, or you might end up being a criminal or just sad or angry.
But I think something is happening right now.
Yes.
That we need to grab the hold on to. And it's an increased relevance of culture in society as a whole. That we've moved, and I think this is very much, I mean, I'd like to think that as the political leadership of the ministry has done something about that, but I think it's more the cultural sector itself, that we have moved away from discussing only the sort of self-value, egenvärdet, of culture and arts, to the value of culture and arts. And it's much broader. And that we now dare to visualize this, and we need to touch that, and we need to communicate that, and therefore there is now a greater relevance, and I would say a greater interest also in other sectors to talk with culture, because they know that if they do, and if we involve culture, not only in tourism and creative industries, but in building, physical planning, health, education, sustainability in a broader sense.
What you're talking about now is the regional way of working.
Yes.
That's exactly the way we always work.
Yeah.
Anybody else from a region here? Yeah. So it's always like infrastructure, healthcare, environment, human rights.
And people who are here from the regions, they know that I've been saying this for 4 years. Like what we see in the local context, it's much more work this way. And what we see in a national context is work this way. Yeah. And we know that to challenge the future, we need to work this way. And that's why we also need a bottom-up vision for this. And from being working with politics on a national level, there's so much to learn from how you actually address things locally. Yeah.
Marika, you want to?
For your speech, and thank you for having us here. It's lovely, a little perspective. I'd just like to have this. You said just one line. You said something happened with culture during the Industrial Revolution, when it sort of changed from being part of our lives into something different, something that we did on our free time. And as you know, and also in this country, all of Europe, there are now political parties who are sort of have some kind of sensation that we should go back to a time before the Industrial Revolution and have only a culture that's part of our life. I just would like you to talk a little more about what actually happened, and how can we sort of address these politicians and these people talking about, like, one of our parties that is now 20% of the population. He says there should only be arts that you can see what it shows, a figurative art, for example. And he talks about that kind of art. So I'd just like you to broaden that discussion a little bit, because we really need that. We read all the arguments for that.
Okay, so I would simply say, if you're going to look back in history, you have to look really carefully at what happened in the 1930s. And similar arguments were being made about a certain kind of national culture. And we know what the consequences were of that. So I think you have to be really careful when you appeal to the past. Also to recognize that there are some bad things that happened in the past, as well as wonderful things. And so, okay, fine. I think that if you're thinking about the future, irrespective of the difficulties of globalization, we also know that we live in a world where interaction across national boundaries has to be part of our long-term economic success, has to be part of our long-term, in my view, social success. And you cannot live in an isolated world. If you try to live in an isolated world, as I was suggesting about monocultures, you will really diminish everything that we value in our lives. But it's easy to say to a group of people who believe what I've just said. It's more difficult with a group of people who don't believe that, who haven't experienced the richness who haven't themselves perhaps understood that actually you need a wider view of the world.
I think also we must take responsibility for creating these talks where we actually try to listen and understand each other instead of saying, you're an idiot, you don't understand the arts, I've seen the light. We need to actually try. Why don't you go to a museum? Are you? What's the obstacle? So we need to provide these meeting places and have these talks much, much more.
The interesting thing is the way in which so many people will say, I myself don't understand about the arts or culture, but I want my children to understand. So when they think about the future, they always think that this does actually represent a new opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's in some way a better world. It's rather, I mean, we are under a lot of pressure in the United Kingdom at the moment in terms of library services. But actually library services are so integrated into society in a way that much arts and culture is not. People use these spaces for all kinds of interaction, as you know only too well, and other people who work in libraries. I'm always envious of people who work in libraries. They never have enough resources, but they always do have the support of their communities.
You're probably welcome to work in a library if you want to. They're understaffed. I hear they're understaffed in England.
But I think, I mean, and I'm happy you say so. I mean, this is also the reason why, as a government, we tried to increase funding to the cultural institutions that are closest to us as people in our communities. The local music and cultural schools, the local libraries. The Royal Library now working with the National Library strategy to make sure that, and also the whole heritage policies and opening up our museums, to make sure that culture is also the arena for that kind of meeting. And I think my experience is that culture can process or facilitate that discussion that outside of the cultural arena we cannot have, because we get too angry with each other and we stop listening. But when culture is the facilitator, then we listen. Then I feel and I recognize you, and from there and on we build resilience, as you mentioned, in our society.
We have some questions.
Yes.
I think people are.
Well, I hope it listening. Thank you very much for your talk, every one of you. Especially this question about how to integrate culture in the society. We have just now an election in the future rather soon. There have been a lot of talk from leaders of the parties. Nobody had mentioned the word culture. They talk about a lot of questions: healthcare, integration, more weapons, and NATO, and so on. And we don't know exactly how to handle it if we are culture lovers. We are sitting here, everyone here is engaged in the culture sector. We have no generals here, and we have no social workers here. Perhaps we have, but mostly...
Yeah, we have a social worker.
Hey!
Mostly we culture lovers talk with each others, and the big question is how can we solve that problem that the culture sector is a part of the society. In the newspaper we have culture pages. That's not in the common pages. We have sport pages for the sport lovers and so on. How can we change that? It must be a part of our life as culture workers to tell people that we are a part of society and we must integrate our society wishes with the traditional politicians. And we have a very important question in that we must look like that the culture is a queen as a solution for one of the big questions, for exactly the integration questions today. It's a culture question.
So Per, maybe that is, can you say
Is that
something
question
about,
to me?
perhaps something about how you work within the...
Sure. No, I mean, I represent a minister who does talk about culture every day, and we wish, of course, that culture was a much higher up on the agenda before the election. But let's understand also the culture of parties, the political parties. They will, or we will, discuss what we can see in the polls are the most important issues for people. and cultural policy is not there. But as I think you mentioning, which I think is the correct way of addressing this, is that if integration, if security issues, if healthcare, if education is on the top of the agenda for the election, how do we make culture, the role of culture in those areas more visible? How can we talk about the role of culture in building civic confidence, in building trust in societies, in improving healthcare, in making sure that education is for all? How can we do that? And we can do that a lot better, I think. But we as cultural lovers, I love the term, I belong to them, we must make sure that it's not only us, because it's always the sector of culture who has to sort of use their elbows to get into healthcare or get into education, to be part of the classroom. We need social workers, teachers, and others to invite and open up and see the value of culture. And I think that discussion is still ahead of us, still in front of us.
Nick, can I then pick up on this? In England, the argument, the sort of the economic argument for arts and culture has been made quite strongly from the arts sector and quite successfully as well. Do you see any risks with that, or is this a way forward, or does it need to be more balanced between other agendas and aspects of the value of arts and culture as well?
Well, I think that, as I've been arguing, the arts and culture should play a part in everyone's life, and everyone would agree with that. I think it's important, as you advance these arguments with politicians, that you don't also lose the recognition that there is, notwithstanding what I've been saying, something very intangible and something very special about an art or cultural experience, which goes beyond the tourist benefit, which goes beyond the economic benefit. That's the bit which is actually difficult to get certain politicians to appreciate. But I don't mind using all these other arguments if it allows us to fund organizations and fund creative individuals who then give us something which becomes memorable, which becomes part of our experience of having visited a given place or seen a particular performance.
There's a good example in Denmark where the Danish Librarian Society, Biblioteksforeningen, they did a survey as to the increase in GDP and tried to see, is there a connection, is there some sort of link with libraries and economic growth? And they could actually find a link, and that was no cultural organization checking it out. It was just straightforward consulting business, always analyzing any business, and they analyzed this, and they could see that if you go into a library, you may be 10 or 11 years old, you get to become one of those culture lovers. You read a lot of books, you take a higher education, you get a higher salary, and you bring in to GDP. So that the cost for libraries in Denmark were then, I think, 4 billion in total, I don't remember. But the increase in GDP, thanks to libraries, was 7. So sometimes we need these arguments, and I think we need to embrace them also a little bit and not be afraid, maybe, because we're always afraid that art will be snatched by some other interest, like, okay, now we're going to save the world, we're going to make people healthier.
Stop people dying.
No, we're going to stop people from dying. No, but you see what I mean? That would somehow hurt art, this fragile thing that we're talking about. But I think we need to talk about both things, probably.
I think Sir Nicholas' example of Hull
Nick,
Nick's example of Hull is it's splendid, because we need more of those. But we don't want societies and villages where people just move away. We want them to stay. We want them to build, to be proud, to find meaning in staying in a rural setting also. And the first thing that comes on top of people's mind then is more or less culture.
But I have some examples. I'm new at my job in the Västra Götaland, as it's called in English, but the Fengerfors paper mill, which is, if you look closer at that, there has to be a whole ecosystem, a chain of things that needs to be in place if you get this place to become a really growing, living cultural place. And that's education, and it's a collaboration with the county administrative board or the Agency for Economic and Regional Growth and the region and the municipality and academia. So
that's why it's so exciting to work in the job you have.
it is
Yeah.
extremely exciting, but the more you do this, you see that collaboration is the thing.
So we have time for 2 more questions. So there's one question here and one question here. Maybe we have time for one third, Benson. So please go ahead.
Martin Gilbert from the British Council. I'm really interested in the discussion you're having, and I'm hearing it again and again, the arts sector needing to break down the barriers into other sectors and become more inclusive in terms of reaching different groups of people and also reaching into really different sectors of society. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that Nick will be on a panel at 1 o'clock this afternoon with a marine ecotologist, another person, a professor from a university in the UK, talking about enzymes that break down plastic PET, and Mandy Barker, who's an internationally renowned photographer of marine plastics, which are clogging up our oceans. Now, it's a good example, I think, of crossing sectors, and ecology, the environment, is something that touches everybody's lives and everybody's hearts. So our attempt in this panel later at 1 o'clock this afternoon is to try and bring these things together. But really enjoying the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. So there's a question here as well on the side of the aisle. No, this one. She waited.
Beautiful discussion and beautiful energy. I'm sitting like, woo-hoo. Yes, and I'm very curious about the experience in England. So question to you, first of all, Nick. I've been myself working with an integration project in the region where we used events and culture and music as a way to integrate the young unaccompanied people who came here. And it warmed my heart really a lot when you said that, British culture has been built also by immigrants a lot, and you have named some big names that were from a bit earlier times. And I'm curious, how has the recent wave of migration, which was named in the media as migration crisis, refugee crisis, how has it affected the acceptance level of other cultures in England? And has there been any change, or has there been any more going against it? Because, for example, in Sweden, when you do an event and you try to bridge the two, when you do an event that's more about Swedish culture, super difficult to bring immigrants. When you do an event about immigrant culture, let's say Afghani music or Syrian music, super difficult to bring Swedish, even younger people. So I'm curious, how is, maybe you have faced the same issue. How is it?
I think last autumn I was at an event which celebrated 50 years since the foundation of the city of Milton Keynes, which is a city 60 kilometres from London. It was a new city. It was built around the idea of the car. It was about the future as it was seen at that moment. And when it was first established, most of the people who lived in it had come out of the poorer parts of London, and they were essentially one class of person, together with another band that was introduced that were kind of managers who had education. So it was a very monocultural city. But when they celebrated their 50th anniversary, they did so with a series of street events that were built around the idea of a mela. Most of the performers were Asian. The whole city was energized by this event. And there was a general recognition that the whole nature of the city had changed, and that it had changed for the better, not for the worse. That actually the richness that had arrived with an immigrant community, albeit that was one that had been there over 10, 15, 20 years rather than 6 months, was actually part of the identity of the city as it moves forward into its second half century. So that felt to me like a very positive solution. And I think the answer is to your question is it doesn't happen overnight. It happens by steady investment by people like the Arts Council or by the National Health Service or by the Education Service to try and draw out. And I do think that it's about holding on to certain identities, but then seeing those identities beginning to infuse, the culture as a whole, not being entirely just separate.
So one last question.
Also, I'm former deputy mayor of Malmö and working with culture, and I've also been in politics. One of the things which is very special, I think it's extra special in Sweden, we are very segmented. Business don't meet politicians, politicians don't meet artists, artists don't meet business, unless of course you're a Secretary of State. But I mean, and it's your job to meet people. If I use my different connections to bring people together, I found out that politicians look strangely at the art people, and the art people look strangely at the politicians. But another thing is also recent experience, the performing arts people don't understand the cultural heritage people. And if I look around, you ask, why don't we reach out? If I look around all these cultural seminars this year, last year, the year before that, yes, we are all, as many have said, we're all the same family, we're all art lovers. However, why isn't there ever someone from business? Why isn't the Minister of Finance invited to a seminar on culture? Why isn't the city planner of Gothenburg invited to a seminar? Why don't we ourselves in this sector reach out? I remember when I was a very young guy entered the city building committee. It took a couple of weeks and I got loads of information from everybody in the sector. Many years later I became the owner, so to say, of one of the biggest cultural budgets in Sweden. No one sent anything. Not the arts organizations, not the Arts Council, nobody. When there is not the infrastructure, we don't take care of the internal information.
Like
we also have to,
Per Olsson.
and finally, yes, we also have, because there is also an internal, also in this sector. Our people, bureaucrats, artists, tend to keep the art politicians out of the sector, which means them less prepared when they meet their colleagues who come from the hospital sector or whatever, full of information. Thank you.
Do you have
I would just say that I think the starting point is at city and region level, where people are living in the same community and they can identify common interests. It's much more difficult at the national level. But I do think that in small, even quite large communities, if you look at a city like, for instance, Manchester, which has transformed itself in the last 15, 20 years by building a community of interests between business, health, the arts, and developing a cultural plan for the city, which brings all those people around the same table. And I think it makes a difference.
Yeah. I mean, I recognize this. I think what I want to mention in this context also the new policy for designed living environments that we've worked with and that that's now passed Parliament in May. And I participated in several panels at this Almedalen on that context and in that policy that we from the Culture Ministry did together with the Environmental Ministry and the Ministry of Industry and Housing, that we now sit in the same panels, in the same discussions with the housing industry, with heritage, with public art, with environmental sustainability actors, and across policy fields. And we now meet and we recognize values from different sectors in that. So we need to create. I mean, what I'm saying is, I think you're correct, and I think what we can do is that we can create new policy fields where we actually engage, and what happens then is fantastic.
But when you have this model, then it can also be scaled. So you can use that as an example. We can work like this cross sectors, and then you can apply that to any other idea that you might get.
The world is full of possibilities.
That's a very good way to end.
That's a good end.
It feels terrible to break up this extremely vibrant and interesting conversation, but thank you so much. I'll hand over to Ulrika.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katti.
Well, thank you very much, all of you on the panel, our keynote speaker. I have a little gift here, very symbolic, very not digital, for you all. I think that one sentence that has stuck in my mind and that I think sort of points into the future that Sir Nicholas mentioned as an answer to the need for international connections was the conversation needs to continue. The conversation needs to be international. And I also feel maybe, because I am very, very sad about Brexit, that we have a particular responsibility to make sure that this conversation continues, and it's been so inspiring. Thank you very much, all of you, and here's a small gift from Kulturrådet. Yes. Måste vara till dig, den fjärde.